Good evening, everybody. All right, good evening, everybody. I'm Shelley Laser. I'm the Director of Lifelong Learning here at Whitehall College, and I'm thrilled to welcome you all to this wonderful event. I'm very excited to have our speaker and so many guests from the community, St. Augustine Historical Society, and just invited guests. Welcome everybody. So I'm going to turn this over to Megan Altus, and she will continue with introductions and welcomes.
Hey. All right, good evening. Thank you all for joining. Thank you all for joining us this evening on this beautiful evening as we listened to Dr. Anthony Dixon. Dr. Anthony Dixon is a native of Fort Valley, Georgia. In 1994, he received his Bachelor of Science degree in history with a minor in African American Studies from Florida A&M University. In 2001, he received a Master's of Applied Social Science from Florida A&M University with a concentration in history. In 2007, he received his PhD from Indiana University's History Department, where he majored in the African diaspora. His studies included African American history and African history with a minor in library science, special collections, and archives. In 2019, he received his MIS, the Master's of Information Science from Florida State University. Currently, he's the founder and president of Archival and Historical Research Associates. I'd like to give a warm welcome to Dr. Anthony Dixon.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. I always like to start at the beginning, especially tonight, as I discuss the Black Seminoles and their involvement and leadership during the Second Seminole War. When I first was introduced to this topic, I was looking at resistance to slavery and oppression. And so this was at my master's level work. And so when I got to my PhD, I was encouraged to continue to look at this fascinating story. But the thing about it is, when I got ready to propose my research, I was asked, why are you doing this? And what do you plan to uncover that hasn't been written about the Second Seminole War already? There have been books about the military. There were even 2 books on the volunteers, a book on the Tennessee volunteers during the war, a book on the Alabama volunteers during the war. So they asked, what did you expect to find that hasn't already been uncovered? And I said, probably nothing. And they sat up and they said, well, why are you doing this? And I said, excuse me, the reason I'm doing this is because research clearly indicates that the Black faction of the Seminole Nation was at separate times the primary objective of the war. Yet no one has looked at this war specifically from their point of view. And so they said, of course, go ahead. And so in order to actually understand the relationship between them and understand how the Second Seminole War actually developed, you really have to look at the Seminole Nation as a whole, and specifically the Native American and the Black relationship. Now, of course, the Black relationship and the Black faction of the Seminoles has its roots in the Gullah culture, which comes out of low country, primarily Carolina. And so as they developed into the Florida Maroons, we find that they began to, of course, develop this relationship with Native Americans. And so we began to see how their culture began to change, just as the Seminoles were beginning to develop. Because of course, the Seminoles themselves are a homogeneous group of Native Americans. Primarily Creek, primarily based in Creek culture, but not solely. So this homogeneous group of Native Americans are meeting and intermingling with these groups of blacks in terms of safety as well as survival. And so to understand and get a full understanding of the Seminole War, you have to first understand that relationship. And so as we look at the earlier parts of the relationship, it was basically solely developed on those ideas of survival. On the Native American side, Native Americans were teaching these blacks how to actually survive through food sources, primarily through hunting, and particularly alligator hunting. And so on the black side, though, because plantation society was beginning to encroach on their land and narrowing their space, their living spaces, they were beginning to have to change the way they were doing agriculture. And this is basically the underlying concept that was the difference and the largest problem initially between Native Americans and Europeans. And that was this idea of land use and property rights. Native Americans, of course, believed in living in spaces, meaning they would develop a village, they would develop a community, and they would live there for a specific period of time, rather. And then they would migrate into another area. And then in that area, they would again begin to develop agriculture, but also hunt the food source. And when the food source began to dwindle there, they would move again, and so forth and so on, for years at a time. So it could be 50 years, 60 years before they are back in the region that they began, or when someone was born. And so, of course, the European concept was completely opposite. They believed in the ownership of land and owning that space, having that space. And so when plantation society began to encroach on those lands, they had to learn how to survive in ways of agriculture in one space. And so it was blacks who actually taught them how to live and conduct agriculture in one space. It is blacks who taught them how to rotate crops, how to understand that certain crops had to be rotated, that you couldn't continuously plant the same crop over and over. You had to rotate, you had to change things of this nature. So it became a very, very symbiotic nature in their relationship. Now, as time goes on, we see the development getting to a point, and when I say as time goes on, we're actually talking about the mid to late 1700s. This is when the Seminoles are outwardly recognized by most Europeans, particularly the English, who are the last who recognized it. We don't see the word Seminole in the English writings until around 1750, 1754. Now, the thing about that is, though, when we look at the word Seminole and we trace the roots of the word Seminole, it first goes back to the word Semolina, which was a Greek word for renegade or breakaway. However, before that, it was the Spanish word Cimarron. And the Spanish were not referring to the Native Americans. They were actually referring to the blacks. And so Cimarron was actually a derogatory word that meant wild or untamed. And so when we look at it and we understand even the origin of the word Seminole has its origins in that relationship, that they were both categorized because they were both recognized as living in the same space. Now, when we look at what we call Florida Maroons, again, our initial understanding is that they developed the first Underground Railroad. But in that process, they also accepted Native American culture. So by the time we get to the late 1700s, we see that the Seminole Nation is beginning to have two primary factions. When we get to the early 1800s, we see that it has organized itself within these two primary factions. And not only has it organized itself, it does have rules. And so when we look at that relationship and we look at the Seminole Nation in its entirety, in that vernacular, in that those ideas, we have to look at it through both lenses. Now, when we look at the relationship, we look through those two lenses, here's what we understand. We understand that within the Black faction of the Seminole Nation, there are actually three different sections. There are those that are originally called Black Seminoles. These are Black Seminoles. These are Blacks who have Native American heritage through their matrilineal line, which means in Native American culture, that means they belong to a clan, which means they grow up in a Native American village and their predominant culture is Native American. Then there's the second sector. That second sector are the Florida Maroons. Now, these are Blacks who have retained their Maroon heritage. They have not ancestrally intermingled with Native Americans, but they live in close proximity. They share different cultural traits, and they live in some type of union. Now, that union doesn't go into any union that gives them any ancestral blood, but more so for survival and living. Now, also within that Maroon, we have another faction within that one. And that is those Blacks who do have ancestral lines, but it is through their father. Their Native American ancestry goes patrilineal, meaning they do not belong to a clan. They still grow up within the Black villages. Now, they are allowed, of course, to go according to the rules of the society that they create within that dynamic. But in a lot of cases, we see that they are allowed to go and visit their father, and their father teaches them things that are Native American ways. But they are not considered Native American. They do not participate in all Native American activities, particularly the corn busk or green corn festival. Now, this was a festival in which Native Americans, particularly the Seminole Native Americans rather, would go about 4 days. Sometimes it lasted a little longer, but it was primarily 4 days in which they would play games. They would air out any grievances. If you had any grievances with your neighbor, if you feel like he owes you 3 horses, he says he only owes you 1, then you would take it to the elders. The elders would then listen to both sides and they would make the decision. All of these things took place at this festival. But the only way that you could participate in this festival is through your clan. And again, the only way you belong to a clan is through your mother. And so when we begin to understand those dynamics, we are able to understand the third sector. The third sector was the runaways. Those blacks who were living on Florida plantations by the late 1700s, early 1800s, who are now absconding and running away and looking for these villages. Now, as we understand it through research, if they came across a Native American village, then they were allowed to stay there only for a certain period of time. After that, they were expected to go to the black village. So what we find then is the black village has the composite of pure Florida Maroons, those who are absconding and running away, and then those who have patrilineal lines with Native Americans. And so as we understand that basic dynamic, then we are able to understand how things progress with each war. And so quickly, and I will get more, of course, into the Second Seminole War, but it's important to understand this with the First Seminole War. When we examine the First Seminole War, we understand that because of the dynamics that were held through the war and through the fighting in first, the War of 1812 and the Patriots War. Now, of course, the Patriots War was a war within the War of 1812, primarily fought over ports. And so those ports, of course, were Tampa, Panama City, Pensacola, Mobile, Biloxi, and of course, New Orleans. Now, what we find is that when the blacks, both the Maroon villages as well as those that live in the Native American villages, began to pick sides, they picked the side of the British, and they fight with the British. And when the British are ultimately pushed out of the region, they leave a fort on the Apalachicola River at Prospect Bluff to the blacks, specifically to the blacks. However, the relationship was such that Native Americans could come at any time. So you had Native Americans who would travel through on their travels, use it as a way station, they would trade, they would visit friends, all of these types of things. It was a communal place, but make no mistake about it, the fort was left to the blacks. Now, when Andrew Jackson, of course, hears about it, and he's brought into the knowledge of it earlier, but after the war, he's brought into the knowledge of how much it has grown. And so plantation society, of course, encourages him to do something about the Negro fort. And so without any word from Washington, without word from the Secretary of War, without word from the president, he decides to do something about it. And so he does come back into this area of La Florida. And that's an important thing to understand as well. At this time, it is still Spanish Florida. But the Spanish are so weak at this point, they are unable to stop any activity. And what we also have found out that even though the Spanish in the 1600s, late 1600s, invited these blacks into La Florida as a way to slow down plantation society in the Carolinas, by the time we get to the early 1800s, they agree with now the Americans that something has to be done with the Negro Fort. They simply say, we're not going to do it, but we don't have anything to do with it as well. And so as far as Andrew Jackson was concerned, that was the green light. And so in 1816, when he comes in and he destroys the Negro Fort, we have now uncovered, well, I take that back. We have now, as a group of Florida historians and the Academy of Florida Historians, is now willing to accept that is actually when the first Seminole War starts. Not when he goes and turns northward and goes into Fowlestown and destroys Fowlestown a week later. And the evidence that we have is that the Seminole Native Americans themselves said that we were going to get revenge for the destruction of the Negro Fort. And just last year in 2023, the primary counsel for the Miccosukee also outwardly declared that indeed the destruction of the Negro Fort was the beginning of the first Seminole War. And so after the first Seminole War, and Native Americans and blacks are pushed down into Central Florida, Tampa region, the Gainesville bands are pushed down into Lake County and present-day Orange County regions, and those small villages that were still on the outskirts of the St. Johns River are pushed down past the Daytona Sanford area. We see major changes. We see major changes for the development of Florida, but we also see major changes within the Seminole Nation. The major change, of course, for Florida is after the first Seminole War, in less than a year's time, in a matter of months, the treaty is signed and Florida is ceded over to the United States. We also see plantation society, particularly cotton, moving into the area that they had coveted the most, which was the area between the Ochlockonee River, which is about 8 miles west of Tallahassee, over to the Swanee River. And so we see cotton moving in immediately. And in less than 12 years, Tallahassee is the epicenter for the cotton industry in Florida. Now, within the Seminole Nation, what we find is that they began to formalize their agreement even more. And so certain aspects were fully developed, as well as ideas of how they were going to fight off the United States and retain whatever land they could. And so at this point, just before the war ends, Andrew Jackson, of course, comes down into the Tampa area, and he again destroys not first the Native American villages, but he destroys the Black village first, which was called Angola. And when he does that, they go even further south, a little further south of Tampa, and they create another area, and some disperse going westward toward the Orlando area, Polk County and the Orlando area. Now, when they go further south, I always like to throw this in there. When they go further south, they develop another community. And so that community got a name. Now, from what we understand, the original name or the original meaning of the word was small girl. But in some of the dialects within Seminole language, it became another word. And that word was Sarasota. And so Sarasota became known in some dialects, meaning runaway Negro plantation. And of course, the English rendition is Sarasota. And so the primary thing within the nation, again, is this fully development. They go into these agreements that solidify their position because they no longer have the Spanish to rely on. They are relying solely upon themselves. And so one of the agreements, and it started earlier, but now it's solidified itself, was the idea of the tribute fields. And so there were 3 fields. Native Americans would grow crops outside of their village. Blacks would grow crops outside of their village. And then there would be a 3rd field. That 3rd field, they would work together, but all of the proceeds would go to the Native Americans, because the Native Americans would take those proceeds and they would trade for things that they needed. And by the late 1820s, early 1830s, they began to trade for ammunition. And so this relationship then also codified itself to the point where historically we stopped calling them the Florida Maroons, and we now collectively call them the Black Seminoles. So what we then find, of course, is that when we look at Lake County now, we look at Lake County, we look at Orange County now, we see all the nice pristine lakes and all of that good stuff. But you have to imagine what it looked like in the 1820s. It was low-lying, swampy, with very little wildlife to live off of. And so they made the decision that they were not going to live in that area, that they were going to return to North Florida, to their lands that they got pushed out of. And of course, this began to create a real problem for plantation society once again. Now, I think it's also important to understand that what we now realize looking through documents, that Andrew Jackson's time in Florida during the first Seminole War, and then as his time as the first territorial governor. He wasn't elected, but he was appointed. And he was only appointed, he only stayed in the position rather for about 9 months. And he got the political bug, he went to DC, and the rest is history, right? But in that, we now understand that this is where he began to develop his full ideas for the Indian removal policy. And that we also have that evidence where when they return and they are sending letters, Andrew Jackson is preparing to be president, basically, in essence, telling them, hold on, we're going to take care of that. And so as the quote unquote Indian agents began to move throughout Florida, they began to come with much harsher measures, much restrictive measures on land. And of course, the one was not to return to North Florida, that no lands in North Florida would belong to Seminoles. And so what we then find is the Black faction of the Seminoles went and developed from being advisors to actual chiefs, because Native Americans relied on them so heavily in terms of negotiation. Many of the Native American chiefs were very low, so to speak, on understanding English. They had a very limited English vocabulary. And so they relied very heavily on Blacks to not only interpret, but then they began to trust their words and their decisions, because they also felt that these Blacks knew these plantation owners better than they do. They understood their mannerisms. They understood when they said certain phrases. And so, again, we saw seeing this progression from simply being advisors to Black Seminole chiefs. Now, these Black Seminole chiefs, of course, are in these Black villages. And that relationship develops more as well. And so what we find is most of the intermarrying at this point takes place at that level. That most of your quote unquote common Native Americans and common Blacks did not intermingle as much to that degree. It was more so of those that were considered trusted advisors, chiefs, and things of their sons and their daughters intermarrying with the sons and daughters of chiefs of Native Americans. And so, as a matter of fact, Abraham, who becomes the primary Black Seminole chief and the most trusted advisor to Micanopy, he actually marries the widow of a Seminole Indian chief. So that kind of gives you an idea of the arrangement in terms of intermarrying. Now, there is one I would like to make sure we understand. There are cultural differences that remain throughout this period of time as well. Excuse me. I think Dr. Terrence Week at University of South Carolina provided the best example when he did his archaeological work here in Florida. The way that we were able to understand and uncover the different villages was through the archaeological evidence. And there were two primary points that were discovered that help differentiate when you come across these findings. First was the structure and the outline of the village itself. The Native American villages were outlined in a dotted or what they call spotted arrangement, where they would just use the whole spatial design. Whereas when we look at the Black Seminole villages, most of their dwellings were in a linear line, just as you see at Fort Mosaic. And that, of course, is what they brought from plantation society. It resembled the enslaved quarters. And so that was the first point that we used to identify the different villages. The second was the pottery. The differentiation that we find with the pottery is that in the Black Seminole villages, the potteries would often have a specific type of quote unquote maker's mark. And that maker's mark were triangular punctures at the top. And we can trace that to the Crew people and other places in Dahomey and other small villages in West Africa. So we understand that the Maroons, even though they are now considered Black Seminoles, they were still retaining some of their culture that they brought from the Gullah, as well as what they brought from Africa. And so when we began to understand the importance, we began to see the full development of Black Seminoles within the Seminole Nation. And so 1826 first begins to solidify things, quote unquote, politically with the United States. In 1826, the Treaty of Indian Springs is basically done between the United States and the Creeks. But what it did was it tried to align the Seminole Nation with the Creeks and bring them back under the Creek Nation so that they can only have one treaty. But in doing so, they also separated the Blacks from the Native Americans and basically claimed that all Blacks, regardless to whether they had a matrilineal line or not, were under the authority of the United States now. And of course, that meant they wanted to return them to plantation society. And so when that treaty is done with the Creeks, Black Seminoles were now faced with what they were looking forward to in the real opposition and the differentiation that the United States government made between them and their Native American counterparts. And of course, the plans that they had. So then when we get closer to the Seminole War, Second Seminole War, particularly in 1832, when we look at the Treaty of Payne's Landing, and Fort Gibson. When we look at those two treaties, we see that they have already, of course, designed the idea that the Seminole Native Americans should be removed to the Arkansas Territory, which of course is present-day Arkansas, as well as Oklahoma, and a very small part of present-day Texas. And so in that treaty, though, it designates this differentiation between the Blacks, and it allows, what it basically does is it allows the Creeks to also have some type of power in terms of enslaving the Black Seminoles, that they can become a part of the trade. And so this, of course, was totally unacceptable by both the Native Americans as well as the Blacks. Native Americans, of course, did not want to leave Florida. They weren't interested in going out to the Arkansas Territory. And now Blacks fully understood that the plan for them was to be returned to enslavement. And of course, we're talking generations now. So we're talking Blacks who had never been enslaved before. But according to plantation society, it didn't matter if your grandfather, your great-grandfather was enslaved. That means you still belong to someone. Didn't matter whether you now had Native American ancestry or not. And so at that point, we also see the seeds of the true differentiation that raises its head during the Second Seminole War. What happens is when the entourage goes out, there's an entourage of Seminole chiefs, Native American chiefs, and there's a small contingency of Black Seminole chiefs, particularly Abraham, that go out to the Arkansas Territory. And of course, they reject the idea because it's basically, at this point, the land designated to them is right next door to the creeks. And the creek's land is almost twice as large, which means you're really telling us you just gave us a piece of the creek, quote unquote, reservation. And so, again, of course, Native Americans rejected that. But here's the thing, you have to understand this. Abraham viewed the Arkansas Territory different. Abraham saw it as a way for his people to live free, out of the way of plantation society, away from slave catchers. And so although he didn't agree with living next to the creeks, in his mind, though, he saw the Arkansas Territory as freedom land to a certain extent. And so what we see when, of course, when negotiations continue to fail because Native Americans are not willing to leave Florida, but B, the United States is not willing to let Blacks leave Florida. And so within those dynamics, of course, negotiations continue to fail until they began to look at how to permanently rid themselves of the Seminoles. Because now expansion was on their mind. Moving into Central Florida, expanding plantation society, and the last one, which was the most important at the time, was moving from territory to statehood. And so the ideas then were, we cannot develop, we cannot expand plantation society, we cannot get people, speculators, investors to come into Florida if we continue to have this problem with the Seminoles. Because what we find also, you have to understand this, Florida really is a primary transplant state. Plantation society develops because the earliest governors, even when the British occupied Florida for a period of 20 years, they invited planters from Carolina and the developing Georgia to come into Florida and invest. And so this is how Florida actually starts to really begin, that plantation owners in Carolina and Georgia are coming into Florida, they're looking around, they're buying large plots of land, they're going home, they're dividing those plots that they bought amongst their sons, they're giving their sons X amount of enslaved people and telling them go to Florida and make your way in life. And so, of course, Florida also, in order to do this in the earliest days, they promised Carolina and Georgia that they would not make rice the primary product, that they would instead make the secondary product, which was indigo, Florida's primary product. And this is how Florida Plantation Society really began to go. And then, of course, by the time we get to the 1800s, early 1800s, cotton takes over. So by the time Florida becomes a territory, it's all about the cotton. And so, again, when we get to the 1830s, what we find is that Black Seminole faction has come to the realization that they are not going to be able to retain their freedom. They are not going to be able to retain that relationship with their Native American counterparts without struggle and fight. So what we find is in 1835, when they start the plantation raids of 1835, which of course lead us into the Second Seminole War, they are conducted in two different manners. From a Native American perspective, these plantation raids are done to slow down the growth of plantation society, to take back some of their land, and to, of course, scare whites from certain areas. But as far as the Blacks are concerned, these plantation raids are being conducted to A, garner supplies for the upcoming conflict, and B, convince more Blacks to run away. And so what we find is the emergence of another leader by the name of John Caesar, who is actually in what we call the St. John's band. So he's in the area around the St. John's River, outside of St. Augustine, south or southwest of present-day Jacksonville. But he's going up and down the St. John's River. And he's conducting plantation raids in order to steal horses, steal guns, and convince runaways to leave. And so he does this throughout the plantation raids of 1835. He becomes the primary go-between the Black Seminoles and those who are enslaved. He is able to go on plantations undetected and meet, talk, convince, and help those who are away. And what we understand is one of the main reasons also is because his wife was still enslaved. So what we deduce is that she had to be what we call a high visitor, meaning she worked in the kitchen, she may have been the laundress, but she worked in a position where if she were to leave, they would notice her gone within an hour and a half at the most. Therefore, if she ran, they would follow her, and then all of the villages, or at least John Caesar's village, would of course be uncovered. So she never leaves the plantation, but she assists him in garnering supplies as well as spreading the word when the next raid was coming and when the next plan for escape was coming. And so we see John Caesar being the right hand of Chief Philip in the St. John's River band. And he becomes his primary advisor as well as negotiator. And this continues on into the war. And so once the war begins, the U.S. government has two directives, right? First directive is Native American removal. The second directive is to return as many Blacks as they can to enslavement. However, because of the vehement way the Blacks opposed their plan, we see in 3 separate times between 1835, early 1836 to 1838, where the blacks are now the main objective in the Second Seminole War. And that the ideas then become that if we can cause a division somehow between the Native Americans and the blacks, then we can easily get the Native Americans to go out to the Arkansas Territory. That it is the blacks who are putting up the most fight. It is the blacks who are causing this war to prolong. And so, of course, the evidence that we clearly have, not only in the field notes, where we have several officers saying that they felt like they had gotten Native American chief ready to sign an agreement, when all of a sudden the black advisor cuts all talk off and they walk away. And so they're even saying in their field notes that they aren't just interpreting, they're making decisions. And so this, of course, in turn causes Jessup to write back the Secretary of War Cass. And he makes, of course, the famous statement that this is not an Indian war. This is a Negro war. And so what we then understand is that the Black Seminoles, excuse me, became the targets. They became the primary objective at certain specific periods in the war. Now, here's the thing that they didn't understand, and it isn't until they get into the war. They didn't understand the relationship of Osceola to the Black Seminoles. They didn't understand that Osceola himself had Black heritage, that his mother was half Black, half Native American. But she was born to a woman, which means she belonged to a matrilineal line, which means Osceola was born into a clan. So even though his father was white, his mother was considered Native American, she was what they also called a mixed breed. And so through that, it takes the United States government and the military time, after doing reconnaissance and things of that nature, to understand what that relationship was, why Osceola always had Black warriors with him. And so they also then understood the relationship between our third primary leader, which is John Horse, who of course in time becomes, by the end of the war and through the transformation out west to the Arkansas Territory, he becomes the primary Black Seminole leader. But at this point, it's still Abraham. John Horse is simply the primary, what we would call war chief for the Black Seminoles, just as Osceola was. Osceola was not a chief. He was declared a war chief because of his fighting prowess and his unwillingness to sign any agreement. And so we understand now, and they understood later on into going into the war, that the relationship between Osceola and John Horse was more than just friendship, because John Horse was a mixed breed himself as well. However, it was his father, Cavajalo, who was his Native American lineage, which means, of course, he grew up in a Black village. But because his father was the chief, and the chief does what he wants, he's able to go back and forth between both villages at will. He's even able to go up to Fort Brooke at will. And of course, there's a story about how he gets the name for John. because he deceives the, some of the military personnel, really the general. He deceives them. And they only laugh about it, and they give him the nickname Gopher John. But make no mistake about it, had he been just a regular Native American or just a regular Black Seminole, they would have done something to him. But because he was the son of a chief, doing something to him could spark something big. And so he was allowed to move through these different spaces. He was allowed to stay in Native American villages at times, because let's call it like it is. Dad is the chief. If daddy wants to see his mama, then they come over, right? And so it takes the military time to understand the full background on Osceola and then John Horse. They actually understood John Horse before they had full comprehension of the relationship between Osceola and John Horse. And so, again, just another quick, in 1836, at the end of 1836, John Caesar is killed. John Caesar is killed on one of these plantation raids. He's still garnering supplies. He's still convincing blacks to run away. And so he gets basically caught. There's a shootout. He's killed. Now, what that did was it solidified John Horse's position, because John Caesar actually was the oldest. John Caesar was actually older than Abraham, from the records that we have indicated. We do not know John Caesar's exact age, their birth date, but we have the approximate descriptions and all of that good stuff. And so when we start looking, right, and once the war actually begins, and of course, December 35, now some say the Dade Massacre, then some say the Battle of Withlacoochee starts it. Regardless, the key aspect here that we have come to understand in terms of looking at the Black Seminole, and we're looking at this thing from the Black Seminole perspective. When we look at the Dade Massacre, Pacheco, the Negro guy, right, becomes a pertinent aspect there. He is the guy that is leading Major Dade to find these different villages, and they're actually also looking for Osceola. And so when Dade is ambushed, there's always the question whether or not Pacheco led them into this ambush, whether or not he was actually with the Seminole Nation. Now, we've uncovered evidence where some Native Americans say they don't know how he survived, because if it was up to them, he was dead. And then there's the evidence that the U.S. military stopped trusting him and always kind of looked at him with a side eye from that point on. And so he does end up living in a Black Seminole village. And he does, when they immigrate, he goes out west with the Black Seminoles. So we will never really know, because that's one thing Pacheco took to the grave, right? Whether or not he actually did conspire. But evidence would suggest that if he did conspire, he did it solely with the Black Seminoles and not with the Native Americans. And so that's an important point because throughout the war, we start seeing where there are different instances where Black Seminoles are reporting first to Abraham, even though there may be a Seminole Native American standing there, they will address Abraham first. There are also instances where they are addressing Osceola first. And so that could be two things, right? That could be the fact that Osceola is considered the primary war chief, or it also could be considered that the fact that they knew Osceola was mixed breed and part black himself. So those conjectures we probably will never, fully understand or fully know with 100% certainty. Now, what we realize is also after the death of John Caesar, the dynamics of the runaways actually do not decrease, they actually increase. Because as the war continues, it encourages more of them to look for their freedom and join the fight. And so here again, we have to understand those dynamics. When a Black absconds from the plantation and he or she runs into the woods and they come across a Native American village, they are not automatically accepted. They are ostracized, they are set off because some, and history has shown us, documentation has shown us, some have gone out into these villages, decided that the village life was too hard for them, and they returned to the plantation. And then, of course, they were punished until they told where they went. And so when they would go into Native American villages, they wouldn't be openly accepted, they'd be ostracized, they would have to prove their worth. Same thing we see happen when they go into these Black Seminole villages. They are worked first. Let's see how much work you do, y'all. You won't be fighting right now. We don't know what you'll tell them. You have to work first. You work, you survive out here, you do the work, you still out here after 3 or 4 months, then okay. But they aren't just openly accepted, and that's by either village. And so when we get to 1837, and the war is going on, and it is beginning to go longer than it's expected. Osceola keeps eluding, gets captured, escapes. John Horse is proven to be much smarter than they have given him credit for. When he escapes, the time that John Horse actually helps him escape, John Horse then negotiates with them to bring Osceola back. And so when they allowed John Horse to go out and quote unquote find Osceola, he loses the military that's supposed to be watching him. He loses the detail, he ditches them, and next thing they know, he's beside Osceola fighting again. And so they are understanding that strong bond as well. And so it gets to the point now where Secretary of War Cass is now feeling the pressure. Of course, Andrew Jackson is no longer in office. It's Van Buren, And so, of course, Van Buren is dealing with the rise of the abolitionist movement. He has to deal with the issue of the Amistad. And so he is looking now at the cost, right? And in his idea, this is too much for a territory. This is not a state, this is a territory. It's costing us too much money and it's making me look bad. And so clear directives come from Cass to Jessup, especially after Jessup sends this word that it's not an Indian war, but a Negro war. And so the decision is then made in 1837 that they're going to now change positions and look at it in two different ways. That they're going to deal with the Native American issue, they're going to deal with the Black issue, but they're going to deal with them now separately with two separate ideas. And so the idea for the Blacks is Van Buren and Cass. Van Buren basically lets Cass know that I'm not overly concerned with a group of Blacks because we're really talking about the concerns of a group of plantation owners. And we're talking about a group of plantation owners in a territory. I got states to worry about. So as far as I'm concerned, you let them go out west if that's what's going to end this war. And so Cass comes back with the two directives. A, you allow Blacks to go out west, and B, you capture Osceola. You capture Osceola, we can deal with the Native Americans. You give Blacks what they want, they'll stop negotiating for Native Americans to stay in Florida. And of course, they were right, because again, the primary objective for Blacks was freedom. And so that, of course, we find once they get out west, I got enough time to get into it a bit. Once we get out west, becomes a real point of contingency, right? That Native Americans are quite upset with Blacks because they quit fighting when they were given their freedom and allowed to go out west. And then, of course, the way that they deal with Osceola is that Jessup does the unthinkable, right? He calls Osceola in on a truce and then arrests him. But as far as Jessup is concerned, the end justifies the means. However, it did cause him to lose his standings with Cass, and then he was ultimately replaced by Zachary Taylor. And so at that point, in 1838, the first thing Jessup tries to come up with was, he says, what if we give them land in the most uninhabitable spaces, right? That we let them have the land that we don't want. What if we just do that? And then take the Black Seminoles, right? We take the Black Seminoles and let them go out there and separate the two, and Seminoles can stay, they'll be happy, and we can get rid of the Blacks, the war will be over. And so they rejected that idea. Cass and Van Buren rejected that. And so it ultimately again pushed him to capturing Osceola and then going ahead and including Article 5 of the Articles of Capitulation, which allowed the Native Americans and their quote unquote allies to immigrate out west. So we see in 1838 a large number of Black Seminoles who are beginning to quit fighting and agree to go out west and, of course, get on the Trail of Tears. And so that, of course, started the first basic contingency and problem between Native American and Blacks in the Seminole Nation that they were upset with them quitting on it. But Blacks reminded them, specifically John Horse, who was now taking more leadership, reminded them that, hey, we were always up against freedom. Freedom has always been our main objective. And we have never lied to you about that. We never wavered about that. And so when they get out west, and during that trip, it takes them a year to get to the Arkansas Territory. And in that year, we see the full transformation from Abraham becoming the primary Black Seminole leader to John Horse becoming the primary Black Seminole leader. And so when they get out west in the Arkansas Territory, from 1838 to 1842, something else happened that Native Americans really, they find it unconscionable. John Horse returns to Florida as a U.S. military agent. And the reason he does that, though, is to convince the other Black Seminoles that it is not a trick, that we are living out west in the Arkansas Territory free, and that you can become free. Now, here's the thing, and this is one of the, and I think this is one of the important things that has to be understood. From what I uncovered and read, when Abraham goes on an emissary, he goes with Micanopy also to Washington, D.C. And in Washington, D.C., they do the negotiations. This is prior to the Second Seminole War, between the First Seminole War and the Second Seminole War. Abraham understood the power and the military might of the United States. He understood that they had to fight for a specific purpose and not fight thinking that they were going to completely win. And even there's even a letter where he writes to the government. He's talking about all the things, other things that he lost and this, that, and the other. But he writes saying to them basically that all we ever wanted was freedom. That was always our main objective. That's all we ever wanted. We didn't really want to impede plantation society. We didn't try to free everybody. We simply wanted freedom for ourselves. And so the thing about it is, Abraham, more than Micanopy, understood that they had to fight for a purpose and not to completely win. And so his negotiations, his tactics, and everything else were to that end. And so I even hear, I've heard with oral history that I take now with Black Seminoles and those that are in close relationship with Seminole Native Americans here in Florida. Seminole Native Americans here in Florida actually still have animosity toward Seminole Native Americans in Oklahoma, present day in Oklahoma. They say they never should have quit, they never should have left. But here's the thing, I'm trying to get the other historians that deal with Seminole history to understand that there's a reason why the Comanche are no longer with us. And that's because the US government annihilated all of them because they fought to the death and ended up getting annihilated. And so the Seminole Native Americans in Florida must understand that if those Seminoles had not gone out to Oklahoma, the entire Seminole Nation would have been annihilated. They were not going to let the Seminole Nation stay in Florida with the numbers that they had. They saw them. The only reason when we even look at the Third Seminole War, the Third Seminole War ends because they decide that A, there's not enough of them left to impede us moving into South Florida, and B, they're pushed in the Everglades, and we don't plan to do anything with the Everglades. So let them have it. And that is the only reason. Those are the only two reasons. They did not continue the Third Seminole War because the numbers were already low and they had pushed them in an area that they did not want, plain and simple. And so again, when we look at the relationship, and I'll wrap it up. I love what I do though. When we look at that relationship, when it gets out west, it deteriorates even more, right? Native Americans still wanted their tribute field, and blacks were like, why are we doing a tribute field now? We're not buying guns, we're not buying ammunition anymore. We all free, we all the same now. Why should we do a tribute field? Then the other thing is, of course, the Arkansas Territory began to develop, right? And the Arkansas Territory, of course, became a slave territory. So slave catchers were coming into and on Seminole land looking for black Seminoles. So they had to move to the further western portion of Seminole land. And those further western portions are today Oklahoma. And so Creeks, who were still, they were a little further away, they separated them a little bit more, but they were still in close enough proximity that even Creeks were coming on to the Seminole land, looking for blacks to take them to Arkansas to trade. And so this pushed John Horse to leave. And he goes, and it takes him about a year, but he goes there to Mexico. Then they live in Mexico for a few years, and they he and of course Wildcat. And when slavery is abolished, they want to come home. But the United States government told them, well, the only way you can come home is that you join the military for a specific period of time. So this is how they end up in Brackettville, Texas, at the fort there. And then, of course, the United States government reneged on their deal and never released them until years later, after they quote unquote finished the rest of the end of the war. So this is why we have black Seminoles in 5 primary areas, regions. That's Florida, the Bahamas, because after the first Seminole War, Nichols goes not back to Europe, but he actually stays in the Bahamas And when he hears about how, they go into the first Seminole War, he gets the British government to offer the blacks again sanctuary. And so they find sanctuary on the largest island in the Bahamas, Andros Island, in Red Bay. And of course, one of the primary cities on Andros Island, other than Fresh Creek, is Nicholstown. So this is how they get to the Bahamas, and then some of them are taken to other British possessions in the Caribbean. Some are taken to Trinidad, some are taken to Barbados. But there aren't any communities there. There weren't enough that they created a full community. The only full community in the Caribbean is those that are presently in red bays on Andros Island. So we have Florida, Bahamas, Oklahoma, Nacimiento, Mexico, and of course, Texas. And those are the 5 regions. And so at this particular point, we are doing what we have the Black Seminole Project, where we're doing a documentary looking at not only the history of Black Seminoles regionally, but we are also letting them talk about the issues that they're dealing with today, because they're facing some pretty hard issues, particularly in Oklahoma. The division between the blacks and Native Americans in Oklahoma has gotten much wider and much worse. And so we're going to look at those different issues in the different regions. Thank you. Question? Yes.
What kind of language barriers are there, with the various communities? I mean, is there a one language that's being utilized, or is there?
Are we talking about present day or?
No, back, but like 1800s, 1730s.
Okay, what happens is, with the language, the Maroons had their own language within the Gullah culture called Geechee.
Mhm.
And so what happens is, as they began to come down into La Florida and into Mingo, right, they began to adopt Native American words into the Geechee language. And then the Geechee transformed into what we call the Afro-Seminole Creole language. So there is that one language that they were spoken that some Native Americans could even understand, because it had Native American words in it.
Oh.
And then, of course, for those blacks that still lived in close proximity, they were able to adopt and learn Seminole language as well. Yes, sir.
I have several questions. You've answered most of them.
Okay.
Very good. But I've heard that the Black Seminoles went down to Mexico as mercenaries.
No. Well, here's the thing. They were said as mercenaries, but the agreement, see, it was the agreement with the Mexican government was that they had to protect that part of the border. Okay. So they had to protect that part of the border, not only just from US citizens, but they wanted to protect that part of the border from some of the plain Native Americans as well. So the idea of mercenaries, the term, it's all in the terminology, right? But yes, it was their duty to protect that part of the Mexican border. So at some time they were in conflict with other Native Americans.
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
I read that Bishop Burrell, the first bishop came out, this he wanted to reach out to the Seminoles who were in the Everglades. Are those the Seminoles he was trying to reach?
Right. See, that's the thing. Throughout all 3 wars, right? when they get dispersed, the majority, after the first Seminole War, wanted to come back and claim their land in North Florida. Some, because of the way Andrew Jackson flushed them out, they were pushed even further south. And so they remained in the southern area. And so what we understood from that point is they began to develop smaller societies such that by the time you get to the Second Seminole War, Key Biscayne is a jump off point where some Seminole Native Americans as well as Black Seminoles are using that to get to the Bahamas. Yes, ma'am.
Do you know if any Black Seminoles or we partners when we joined Obama Republic and they did that retreat because they were pro-union and he thought that the free labor and economics and freedom that they fought with them and it was partners to remain to me.
The only Blacks that we understand to be a part of those contingencies and those types of contingencies are those that belong to a clan that were actually within the Native American culture. Yes,
Speaking of the Trail of Tears,
yes.
when they took the Cherokee on the Trail of Tears, I know that was around 1830. Did they at the same time have different forces to force the Seminoles out to Oklahoma, like they were doing in Cherokee?
Yes, basically the route was this. They would take them to Tampa. Tampa, they would put them on a ship, go across the Gulf to an area. There was two different areas, one in Louisiana, the other one was right at the present day Louisiana-Texas border. But both of them went to a port in Louisiana. And it wasn't a main port. They used, of course, they weren't going to use New Orleans. They used a desolate port. And then from Louisiana, they marched them up to Arkansas, to the Arkansas territory. That's why it took a full year.
Thank you so much.